The trauma bay doors slammed open at 2:47 in the morning, and I did not know yet that the man on the gurney was about to unravel 15 years of silence I had built my entire life around. I was Dr. Wren Alders, chief of surgery at Cascade Regional Medical Center in Portland, and I had walked into that trauma bay the same way I walked into every trauma bay, with my hair pulled back tight, my mind already 3 steps ahead of the paramedics still shouting vitals. Multiple rib fractures, possible internal bleeding. Male, approximately 60 years old, unresponsive at the scene, now conscious but disoriented. I did not look at the face first. I never look at the face first. I look at the chest rising and falling, I look at the monitor, I look for the things that will kill a person in the next 5 minutes if I do not act. It was only after I called for the ultrasound and pressed my hand against his abdomen to check for rigidity that his eyes opened. And he looked up at me, and his whole body went still in a way that had nothing to do with his injuries. "Wren," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable of my name like something had physically broken inside his throat. I froze for exactly 1 second. 1 second is a long time in a trauma bay. My resident, a sharp young man named Desmond Ortiz who had no idea what he had just walked into, glanced at me because he heard the shift in the room before he understood it. I looked down at the man's face, really looked, past the blood and the oxygen mask and the 15 years that had carved deep lines into skin I used to know better than my own mother's. Roy Draper. The man who raised me from the time I was 12 years old until the night I ran away at 17 with nothing but a duffel bag and a rage so cold it kept me warm through 3 months of sleeping in my car. The man who put my dog, my Chester, out on the side of the road while I was at school and told me he ran away and never once looked sorry about it. "Please," he whispered, his hand trembling as it reached toward my sleeve, too weak to actually grab it. "Save me. Please, Wren, I know I don't deserve to ask you, but please." I did not answer him. I could not answer him, not then, because a person was dying on my table and my job in that moment was not to be his stepdaughter, it was to be the surgeon standing between him and the ceiling. But even as I called out orders, even as I pressed my palm flat against internal bleeding I could feel pooling under his ribs, some small, furious, 17-year-old part of me was screaming a question I had never let myself ask out loud in 15 years. Why should I? To understand why that question nearly broke me in half, you have to understand who I was before Roy Draper ever walked into my mother's kitchen and started rearranging the furniture of our lives. My name is Wren Alders, and I grew up in a small yellow house in Eugene, Oregon, with a father who used to lift me onto his shoulders so I could reach the cherries on the tree in our backyard, and a mother, Marlene, who sang off-key in the car and never once cared that she sounded terrible. My father, Everett Alders, was a firefighter, and he died when I was 8 years old, pulling a family out of a burning duplex 2 streets over from a fire that should not have killed him, that everyone said should not have killed him, except that the roof came down at the wrong second, and it did. I do not remember much from that year except the smell of casseroles other people brought to our door and the way my mother stopped singing in the car for almost 2 years. When I was 12, my mother met Roy Draper at the community college where she was taking night classes to become a paralegal. Roy was a contractor, broad-shouldered, quiet in a way that seemed steady at first, the kind of quiet my mother mistook for strength because she was so tired of holding everything up by herself. He had a son from a previous marriage, Desmond, who was 2 years younger than me, a small, wheezing, anxious boy who flinched at loud noises and carried an inhaler in his jacket pocket at all times. Roy married my mother when I was 12 and a half, and we moved into his house on the other side of town, a house that always smelled faintly of sawdust, and underneath that, something colder that I could not name until much later. Roy was never outright cruel to me in those early years, not in a way anyone outside the house could point to. He simply had a way of making it clear, in 1,000 small silences, that I was a guest in a life that had already been fully furnished before I arrived. He praised Desmond for things he criticized in me. He remembered Desmond's soccer schedule and forgot my recitals. When my mother tried to include me in family decisions, Roy had a way of tilting the conversation, gently, always gently, so that my preferences dissolved into everyone else's. My mother, still grieving my father in ways she never spoke about, seemed almost grateful for someone else to make the decisions, and I did not blame her for that. Not really, not even then. I just felt myself becoming smaller inside my own home. The one thing that made those years bearable was Chester. Chester was a golden retriever mix I found half-starved behind the dumpster of the grocery store where I bagged groceries on weekends, back when I was 13. I begged my mother for 2 weeks before she finally said yes, and I still remember the way Roy's jaw tightened when she told him, the way he said, "Fine, but he's her responsibility, not mine." As if I had asked him to take on a second mortgage instead of a scared, skinny dog who flinched at raised hands the same way Desmond did. Chester slept at the foot of my bed every single night for 4 years. He waited for me at the end of the driveway every afternoon when the school bus dropped me off, sitting perfectly still until he saw me step down, and then exploding into a run so full of joy it looked like flying. After my father died, I had spent years feeling like a ghost in my own house, like a girl nobody quite knew what to do with. Chester was the first living thing who looked at me like I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. I loved that dog with the specific, desperate intensity of a kid who has already learned that people you love can disappear without warning. The trouble started when I was 16, in small ways I did not take seriously enough at the time. Desmond's asthma had been getting worse for months, though nobody told me the full extent of it, because in Roy's house, health problems were private matters handled behind closed doors, not things a stepdaughter needed to know about. Desmond had started using his rescue inhaler more frequently. There were 2 trips to urgent care I only heard about secondhand from my mother, hushed conversations in the kitchen that stopped the moment I walked in. I noticed Roy started keeping Chester out of certain rooms, started complaining more about dog hair on the furniture, started sighing heavily whenever Chester followed me into the living room. I chalked it up to Roy simply being Roy, a man who had never wanted the dog in the first place and never missed a chance to remind everyone of that fact. Then, on a Tuesday in October during my junior year, I came home from school and Chester was not waiting at the end of the driveway. I told myself he was inside, maybe sleeping, maybe in trouble for chewing something he shouldn't have. But the house felt wrong the second I walked in, too quiet in a way that had a particular, awful texture to it. My mother was not home yet, still at work. Roy was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and he did not look up when I asked where Chester was. "He ran off," Roy said, in the flat, unbothered tone of a man reporting the weather. "Left the gate open by accident this morning. I looked around the block, couldn't find him. I'm sure he'll turn up." I did not believe him, not even in that first instant, though I could not have told you why. Maybe it was the way he said "by accident" too carefully, like a line he had rehearsed. I spent that entire night walking the neighborhood in the rain, calling Chester's name until my voice went hoarse, papering telephone poles with flyers I had made on our home printer with a photo of Chester grinning his ridiculous, gap-toothed grin. My mother helped me search too, genuinely distressed, and I remember thinking even then that her fear looked real in a way Roy's calm did not. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Havorson, an elderly woman who spent most of her days on her porch with a cup of tea and a clear view of our entire street, who finally told me the truth 4 days later. She had seen Roy that Tuesday morning, before school, loading Chester into the bed of his truck and driving away with him, the dog whining and scrabbling against the tailgate. She had assumed he was taking him to the vet. She only mentioned it because she saw my flyers and felt she owed me the truth. I confronted Roy that night in the kitchen, my mother standing frozen by the sink, and for the first time in 4 years of living under his roof, I watched Roy Draper's careful, controlled face crack open into something uglier underneath. He admitted it, finally, flatly, without a single note of apology in his voice. He said he had driven Chester 40 minutes away and let him out near a wooded area outside the city, told himself someone would find him, take him in, that it was a clean way to handle it. He said the dog had been a problem for months, that he had made a decision for the good of the household, and that I should be grateful he had not simply had the dog put down instead, which he said as though it were a mercy rather than a threat. He did not mention Desmond's asthma once. He did not explain anything. He simply stood there, arms crossed, waiting for me to accept that this was how things were now. I do not remember deciding to leave. I remember standing in my room that night, throwing clothes into a duffel bag with hands that would not stop shaking, my mother knocking softly on the door and me refusing to open it because I could not bear to hear her defend him, even a little, even out of exhaustion. I left a note that said only, "I can't live somewhere that does that to something I love. I'll call you when I'm okay." I was 17 years old, and I climbed into the ancient Honda Civic my father had left me, the one thing in that house that was undeniably mine, and I drove until the gas light came on, and then I slept in the back seat in a grocery store parking lot, and I did not go home again for 15 years. Before I go further into what happened in that hospital, I need you to understand exactly what those 4 years under Roy's roof cost me, because it is impossible to understand why his single word, "Please," nearly buckled my knees in that trauma bay, without understanding the small, quiet damages that came before the dog was ever put in the back of that truck. Roy was not a man who yelled. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect a villain in these stories to be loud, and Roy's particular cruelty was almost entirely made of silence. He had a way of looking through me at the dinner table when I spoke, waiting a beat too long before responding, just long enough to make it clear my sentence had not been worth his full attention. He kept a mental ledger of small infractions, dishes left in the sink, a curfew missed by 11 minutes, and he would bring them up weeks later, calmly. As evidence in some larger case, he seemed to be building against my right to belong in that house. My mother often did not see it, because Roy was careful never to do it in front of her for long, and because grief had made her tired in a way that made her grateful for anyone willing to run a household so she did not have to. I do not blame her for not seeing it sooner. I have spent enough years now as a physician to understand how thoroughly exhaustion can blind even a loving parent to the quiet suffering of a child right in front of them. But I remember, vividly, learning to make myself smaller in that house, to laugh a little less, to need a little less, because needing things from Roy Draper always seemed to cost more than it was worth. That first winter alone was the hardest thing I have ever survived, and I say that as a woman who has since spent entire nights holding pressure on wounds that should have killed the people underneath my hands. I learned which 24-hour diners would let a teenage girl nurse a single cup of coffee for 3 hours without anyone asking questions. I learned which gas station bathrooms had locks that worked, and which parking lots the police did not patrol closely after midnight. I kept my grades up out of pure stubbornness, because some hard, unbending part of me had decided that Roy Draper would not also get to take my future along with everything else. And there were nights I did my calculus homework by the dome light of that Honda, with my hands shaking from cold rather than nerves. I did not tell my teachers what was happening at first, out of a shame I could not fully explain even to myself, the particular shame of a kid who believes, wrongly, that being discarded by an adult somehow reflects a flaw in her rather than in him. It was my guidance counselor, a sharp-eyed woman named Priscilla Enkemelu, who finally noticed the pattern, the same clothes worn 3 days in a row, the way I lingered in the library until the janitor locked up, and who gently, persistently, refused to let me deflect her questions until I finally told her the truth in her small, cluttered office with the door closed. The next several years of my life were not the kind of thing that fits neatly into a montage. I finished my senior year of high school technically enrolled at 3 different schools, crashing on the couches of 2 different friends whose parents took pity on me, working 2 jobs, a diner in the mornings before school, and a gas station on weekends, saving every dollar I could into a coffee can I kept hidden under a loose floorboard. My mother called constantly at first, and I answered sometimes, always keeping the conversations short, always steering away from any mention of Roy or of coming home. She never once, in those early calls, told me she had confronted him, never told me she had made him account for what he did. I understood, even through my anger, that she was still finding her footing in her own marriage, still afraid of losing another version of stability after losing my father. But understanding, it did not make it hurt less. What saved me, more than anything, was a woman named Corinne Vasquez, the ER nurse manager at the urgent care clinic, where I ended up on a Friday night my senior year, with a badly sprained ankle from slipping on I. See outside the diner. Corinne noticed the exhaustion under my eyes, noticed the way I flinched when she asked, gently, if everything was okay at home. She did not push. She simply gave me her card and told me that if I ever needed anything, absolutely anything, I should call. I called her 2 weeks later when I had nowhere to sleep because the friend I had been staying with was moving out of state with her family. Corinne and her husband let me stay in their spare room for the rest of my senior year, no strings attached, the kind of quiet, unglamorous kindness that rebuilds a person from the inside out. It was Corinne who sat with me at the kitchen table, filling out my college applications. Corinne who drove me to take the SATs. Corinne who told me, the night I got my acceptance letter to Oregon State on a partial scholarship, that she had never doubted for one single second that I would make it. I studied biology on that scholarship, working nearly full-time on top of a full course load, sleeping 4 hours a night more often than I care to admit, driven by something that was equal parts ambition and fury. I got into medical school at Oregon Health and Science University on loans that would take me a decade to pay off. And I chose surgery, specifically trauma surgery, because there was something about the immediacy of it, the way it demanded total focus and left no room for anything but the body in front of you, that felt like the only kind of peace I knew how to access. I met my husband, Julian, during my 3rd year of residency, a quiet, steady ICU nurse with an easy laugh who never once made me feel like my past was a burden he had to manage. We married 5 years ago. We have a daughter, Nora, who is 4 years old and afraid of thunderstorms, and obsessed with a stuffed elephant she refuses to sleep without. 2 years ago, I was named Chief of Surgery at Cascade Regional, the youngest person and the first woman to hold that position in the hospital's history. I built, brick by brick, over 15 years, a life that had absolutely no room in it for Roy Draper. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday night in March, he was wheeled into my trauma bay after a 2-car collision on Highway 26, and every carefully constructed wall I had spent 15 years building cracked straight down the middle. The surgery itself lasted just under 4 hours. Roy had a lacerated spleen, 2 fractured ribs that had punctured close enough to his lung to cause a partial collapse, and internal bleeding that, had he arrived even 20 minutes later, would very likely have killed him. I operated on him the way I operate on every patient, with total, unwavering focus, because the moment you let anything else into your head in that room, you start making mistakes that cost lives. I did not think about the driveway, or Chester, or the duffel bag, or the note I left on my bed 15 years ago. I thought about his splenic artery and the clamp in my hand and the numbers on the monitor. It was only after we closed him up, after I stripped off my gloves in the scrub room and looked at my own hands under the fluorescent lights, that the full weight of what had just happened hit me so hard I had to sit down on the little metal stool in the corner and put my head between my knees for a full minute before I trusted myself to walk out into the hallway. Roy remained in the ICU for 6 days. I did not visit him during that time, not because I was avoiding him exactly, but because I genuinely did not know what I would say, and I have always believed that saying nothing is better than saying something you will regret. My mother arrived on the 2nd day. I learned this from the nursing staff before I learned it from her directly, because apparently she had asked, tentatively, whether Dr. Alders and the patient in room 412 were related, and word travels fast in a hospital. She found me in the surgeon's lounge on the 3rd day, and I almost did not recognize her at first, not because she had changed so drastically, but because grief and time had worn new lines into a face I had spent 15 years trying not to picture. She looked smaller than I remembered. She looked, more than anything, afraid. "I don't expect you to forgive either of us," she said, standing in the doorway like she was not sure she had the right to come further in. "I just needed you to know that I never stopped looking for you. Not really. I hired someone to check on you 2 years after you left, just to make sure you were alive. I found out you'd gotten into college, and I didn't reach out because I was terrified you'd hang up on me. And some cowardly part of me decided that not knowing for certain was easier than being told no." I did not say anything for a long moment. 15 years of rehearsed anger sat behind my teeth, and none of it came out the way I had always imagined it would. Instead, what came out was smaller and more exhausted than fury. "Did you ever ask him why?" "He did it," I asked. "Did you ever actually make him answer for it?" My mother's face crumpled in a way that told me the honest answer before she spoke it. "Not the way I should have," she admitted. "I was so afraid of losing another marriage, another version of stability, that I let myself believe his explanation was enough. It wasn't enough. I've known for years it wasn't enough. I just didn't know how to fix something that broken without breaking everything else along with it." It was 3 days later, when Roy was finally stable enough to have a real conversation and strong enough to sit up in his hospital bed, that the second half of the truth finally surfaced. The half that none of us, not even my mother, had fully understood at the time. I went to see him alone, in my white coat, less as his stepdaughter and more as the surgeon who had a professional obligation to check on her patient's recovery, though we both knew that was only half true. Roy looked at me for a long time before he spoke, his hands twisting the edge of the hospital blanket. "Desmond's asthma got a lot worse that fall," he said, his voice rough. "Worse than I ever told you, worse than I let your mother fully understand either, if I'm honest. He had 2 attacks that landed him in the ER, one bad enough that the doctor told me flatly that continued exposure to dander in the house could put him in real danger, could send him into a full respiratory crisis." I panicked. I didn't know how to have that conversation with a 17-year-old girl who loved that dog more than she loved almost anything else in her life after losing her father. I told myself I was protecting my son, but that's not really why I did what I did, not the way I did it. He stopped, jaw working, and for the first time in my entire memory of him, Roy Draper's eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide. "The truth is, I was a coward. I could have found Chester a proper home. I could have called a rescue, or a shelter, or even just told you honestly what was happening with Desmond and let you help me find a real solution. Instead, I did the easiest, ugliest thing because I didn't want to have a hard conversation, and then I lied to you about it. And when you found out the truth, instead of admitting I was wrong, I got defensive because I was ashamed. I let a 17-year-old girl walk out of my house alone in the middle of the night rather than say 4 words. I'm sorry, I was wrong." I stood there in the doorway of that hospital room for a long time, feeling something in my chest that was not quite forgiveness, not yet, but was no longer only rage either. "You could have told me," I finally said. "You could have trusted me to understand something as simple as your son's health being in danger. I would have helped you find Chester a good home myself. I would have grieved, but I would have understood. What I could not survive was being lied to, and then punished for being angry about the lie." "I know that now," Roy said. "I've had 15 years to know that. I just never had the courage to say it to your face, and then too much time passed, and I told myself it was too late, that you'd built a life that didn't need me in it, and that showing up would only hurt you more. I was wrong about that too. I should have tried. Every year I didn't try was its own kind of cowardice." That conversation did not fix 15 years in an afternoon, and I want to be honest about that, because the real, hard work of what came after mattered far more than that one hospital room admission ever could have on its own. I told Roy, plainly, that his words meant something, but that words alone would not be enough, not after everything. I told him that if he genuinely wanted any kind of relationship with me going forward, it would have to be built slowly, with consistent proof, not promises. He agreed, without arguing, without the old defensiveness I remembered from that kitchen 15 years earlier. And something about the ease with which he accepted those terms told me more than any apology could have. Over the following months, Roy did the actual work of becoming a different man than the one who had put my dog on the side of a road and lied about it. He started seeing a therapist, a decision he made entirely on his own before I ever suggested it, something my mother told me about with quiet pride the next time we spoke. He wrote me a long letter by hand, laying out not just an apology but a full, unflinching account of the choices he had made and why, without a single excuse woven into it, which he asked me to read only if and when I felt ready. He reached out to Desmond, now a grown man working as a paramedic in Salem, and had a conversation with him too, apologizing for how he had handled the situation all those years ago, and for the guilt Desmond had quietly carried since childhood, believing his asthma was somehow the reason his stepsister had vanished from their lives. My Other, for her part, began seeing a counselor as well, working through her own patterns of conflict avoidance that had let so much go unaddressed for so long, and she started calling me not to ask for anything, but simply to tell me she loved me and was proud of the woman I had become, with no expectations attached to those words. About 7 months after that first hospital conversation, Roy asked, through my mother, whether I would be willing to attend a single session with him and the family therapist he had been seeing, not to force reconciliation on any particular timeline, but simply so that he could say certain things directly to my face, in a controlled setting, with someone trained to keep the conversation honest. I almost said no. Part of me worried that walking into that office would feel like handing him a stage, a chance to perform contrition for an audience rather than actually living it out day to day the way I had asked. But Julian, who has always had a clearer read on people than I sometimes give him credit for, pointed out that avoiding the room entirely was its own kind of fear, and that I had spent my whole adult life running toward hard rooms, not away from them, in every operating theater I had ever walked into. So I went. The therapist, a calm, unflappable woman named Odalise Ferreira, spent the first 20 minutes simply laying ground rules, no interrupting, no minimizing, no explaining away another person's pain. Roy sat across from me in a small beige armchair that seemed to swallow him, and when it was finally his turn to speak, he did not reach for a single excuse. He told me, in front of a stranger whose entire job was to catch him if he flinched from the truth, that he had spent Desmond's childhood terrified of being seen as an inadequate father. A fear rooted in his own upbringing by a father who had been genuinely, physically cruel to him. And that when his fear collided with a real medical crisis involving his son, he had reached for control instead of honesty, because control was the only tool his own childhood had ever taught him how to use. He said this was context, not an excuse, and he repeated that distinction twice, unprompted, as though he had rehearsed it precisely so he would not let himself slide into using his own pain as a shield against mine. By the end of that session, I did not feel healed, exactly. But I felt, for the first time since I was 17 years old, that Roy Draper finally understood the actual size of what he had taken from me. Not just a dog, but 4 years of feeling unwelcome in my own home. And the version of my adolescence I never got to have, because I spent it instead sleeping in the back seat of a Honda Civic in a grocery store parking lot. It took nearly a year before I let Roy meet Nora for the first time, and I remember standing in my kitchen watching him kneel down slowly to her level, his old knees clearly protesting, so he would not tower over her, watching him ask her gently if she would like to see a picture of a dog on his phone, a rescue mix named Biscuit that he had started volunteering with at a local animal shelter. Part of the amends he had decided, without me ever asking. That he owed not just to me, but to the memory of a dog he had wronged 15 years earlier. Nora, who has never met a dog picture she did not love, climbed straight into his lap without hesitation, and I stood in that doorway with my arms crossed and my eyes stinging, watching a man I had spent 15 years hating hold my daughter like she was made of glass. I also learned, that same year, what had actually happened to Chester, a piece of the story I had carried as an open wound for 15 years without ever having the full truth of it. Corrine, my old mentor, still connected to people around Eugene, had helped me track down animal control records from that period out of her own quiet determination that I deserved closure. Chester had been picked up by a family living near where Roy had let him out, a retired schoolteacher and her husband who had fostered dogs for decades. He had lived with them for 11 more years, sleeping at the foot of their bed the same way he once slept at the foot of mine, until he passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 15. There was even a photograph, grainy and a little faded, of Chester at what must have been 12 or 13 years old, gray around the muzzle, grinning that same gap-toothed grin at a rope toy in a sunny backyard. I cried harder looking at that photograph than I had cried in the entire 15 years since I had left, not out of grief, but out of something closer to relief, the specific relief of finally knowing that something you loved and lost had, against all odds, been okay. Last Thanksgiving, for the first time in 16 years, I hosted my mother and Roy in my own home. Julian carved the turkey while Nora chased Biscuit, whom Roy had officially adopted from the shelter that spring, around the living room, and my mother sat at my kitchen table doing the exact thing she used to do when I was a little girl, singing off-key while she peeled potatoes, no longer holding back the parts of herself grief had once silenced. Roy helped Julian with the dishes afterward, and at one point, drying a plate with a towel, he looked over at me and said, quietly, so only I could hear, "I don't take a single one of these dinners for granted. I know I don't deserve them. I'm just grateful you decided I was worth the chance to try." I did not have a perfect response ready, because there is not always a perfect response to something like that. I simply told him that people are allowed to become better than the worst thing they ever did, as long as they are willing to do the actual work of becoming better, and that watching him do that work, consistently, for over a year now, was the only reason we were all sitting at that table together at all. I still think about that duffel bag sometimes, about the 17-year-old girl who drove until the gas light came on with nothing but rage and grief, and an unbearable love for a dog who could not understand why she never came home. I think about how easy it would have been to let that rage calcify into something permanent, to let Roy Draper remain, forever, only the man who threw away something I loved and never looked back. But healing, real healing, was never about pretending the wound had not happened. It was about watching, patiently and with clear boundaries, whether the person who caused it was willing to become someone incapable of causing it again. Roy did that work. My mother did that work. And because they did, Nora will grow up with grandparents who show up, fully and honestly, instead of a fractured family held together by silence and unspoken hurt the way mine once was. Some nights, watching Roy sit on my back porch with Biscuit's head resting on his knee, Nora curled up beside them both listening to some story about a golden retriever named Chester, who used to run down a driveway faster than anything in the world. I think that this messy, hard-won, fully earned peace, is a better ending than any version of revenge I ever let myself imagine during those long, cold nights, sleeping in the back seat of my father's old Honda Civic. And I would not trade it for anything.